The morning sun poured its golden light over the bustling airport, casting long shadows on the gleaming floors as passengers shuffled through the gates. Among the sea of travelers was Evelyn Johnson, her presence quiet but commanding. Her silver hair, tied neatly into a bun, shimmered faintly in the sunlight, a testament to years of wisdom and experience. Dressed in a simple cardigan and slacks, she moved with an understated grace, her leather travel bag slung casually over one shoulder. To the casual observer, she was just another elderly woman embarking on a journey. But those who dared to look closer might have noticed the fire in her eyes, a quiet determination honed through decades of overcoming challenges most could never imagine. Evelyn's first-class ticket sat securely in her hand, though she held it without pride or pretense. This wasn't a luxury she sought to flaunt, it was a necessary indulgence for a trip to visit her great-granddaughter. The little girl had been the light of her life ever since Evelyn's daughter had passed, leaving behind a legacy that Evelyn cherished deeply. Despite her outward calm, Evelyn felt the familiar twinge of unease that airports always brought her, not because of the chaos, but because of the subtle glances, the fleeting judgments that came her way. As she approached the check-in counter, the young airline agent greeted her with a polite but hesitant smile. Evelyn had seen that look before. It was a kind of smile that hid doubt, the type that questioned why someone like her, older, modestly dressed, and black, would hold a ticket for the most exclusive section of the plane. "Good morning, ma'am," the agent said, her tone dripping with forced cheerfulness. "May I see your ticket?" Evelyn handed it over without a word, her sharp eyes catching the brief flicker of skepticism that crossed the agent's face. The young woman scanned the ticket, hesitating for just a second too long before plastering on her smile again. "First class," she murmured, almost to herself, as if she needed reassurance that the ticket wasn't a mistake. "Thank you, Mrs. Johnson. Have a pleasant flight." Evelyn nodded, her expression neutral. "You too," she replied simply, collecting her documents and moving forward. The moment might have seemed inconsequential to others, but for Evelyn, it was a small but familiar sting, a reminder of the assumptions people often made. Security was no different. As Evelyn stepped through the metal detectors and placed her belongings in the trays, she caught snippets of whispers from a group of passengers behind her. "First class, she doesn't look the type," one man muttered, his voice low but audible enough for Evelyn to hear. She didn't flinch. Decades of facing down prejudices far greater than a stranger's words had taught her to remain composed. Her hands moved steadily as she collected her belongings and adjusted the strap of her bag. She had no interest in confronting the man or explaining herself. Her life's work had always been about letting her actions speak louder than any words. The first-class lounge was a sanctuary of quiet compared to the noisy terminal. Evelyn settled into a plush chair, her well-worn copy of *Invisible Man* resting in her lap. She opened the book, letting its words transport her, a welcome escape from the microaggressions she had silently endured throughout the morning. But even in the tranquility of the lounge, she couldn't fully relax. A faint murmur of voices and sideways glances reminded her that even here, she was an anomaly. When the boarding announcement came, Evelyn stood, straightening her cardigan with the same precision she had once used to adjust her flight suit. She walked to the gate, her steps measured, her gaze steady. The flight attendants greeted her warmly, their smiles more genuine than those she had encountered earlier. But as she stepped onto the jet bridge, she caught sight of the pilot standing near the entrance. His sharp blue eyes scanned the passengers, pausing briefly when they landed on her. His expression was unreadable, but there was a flicker of something, curiosity, perhaps, or doubt. "Good morning," he said, his tone polite but tinged with an edge of formality. "Are you sure you're in the right line?" Evelyn met his gaze with a calm, unwavering smile. "Positive," she replied, handing over her boarding pass. The pilot's lips tightened ever so slightly as he glanced at the ticket, then back at her. "Of course," he said finally, stepping aside to let her pass. Evelyn moved forward without another word, but she felt the weight of his stare lingering on her back. Seated by the window, Evelyn began arranging her belongings. She placed her bag under the seat and adjusted her tray table, her movements slow and deliberate. She was just settling in when she sensed someone approaching. Looking up, she saw the pilot standing beside her, his expression unreadable. "Ma'am," he began, his voice low but firm, "I'd like to confirm you're in the correct seat. Sometimes passengers get confused about their assignments." Evelyn straightened, her gaze meeting his with quiet intensity. "I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be," she said, her voice calm but resolute. She gestured toward the boarding pass resting on her tray table, the evidence clear and indisputable. The pilot glanced at the pass, his jaw tightening. After a moment, he nodded curtly. "Let us know if you need anything," he said before turning sharply and walking away. Evelyn exhaled slowly, her fingers tightening around the armrests. The encounter had left her with the old, familiar sting of prejudice, but she refused to let it rattle her. She had faced far greater storms in her life. This was nothing more than a minor squall. As the plane ascended smoothly into the sky, Evelyn allowed herself to relax slightly. The familiar hum of the engines soothed her nerves, reminding her of her years in the Air Force. She gazed out the window at the clouds below, their fluffy expanse stretching like an endless ocean. For a moment, she felt a flicker of peace. But peace, she knew, was often fleeting. Half an hour into the flight, the tranquility shattered. The plane jolted violently, sending gasps rippling through the cabin. Evelyn's sharp instincts kicked in immediately. She sat upright, her eyes scanning the other passengers, the tension palpable. The turbulence intensified, and the seatbelt sign blinked urgently. Murmurs of fear spread through the cabin, and even the flight attendants struggled to maintain their composure. The captain's voice crackled over the intercom, steady but strained. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're experiencing unexpected turbulence. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened." Evelyn frowned. Something was off. Her years of experience had taught her to recognize the subtle signs of trouble, and she couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't ordinary turbulence. Her sharp ears caught a faint shift in the engine's pitch, a subtle, almost imperceptible change that sent a chill down her spine. She leaned forward, her eyes narrowing. Whatever was happening, it wasn't good, and she couldn't shake the feeling that this flight, so ordinary just moments ago, was about to become anything but. Evelyn's eyes darted around the cabin as the plane jolted again, harder this time. The nervous whispers from the passengers grew louder, and a child in the row behind her began to cry. The flight attendants, though trained for such moments, were visibly on edge. Evelyn's instincts, honed over years in the cockpit, told her this was more than just bad weather. Her fingers gripped the armrests, her mind already analyzing every possibility. She could feel the faint tremor in the engines reverberating through the plane, a rhythm that spoke of something struggling to maintain balance. The young flight attendant who had served her earlier moved cautiously down the aisle, bracing herself against the seats. Evelyn caught her attention with a subtle wave of her hand. "Excuse me," Evelyn said, her voice calm but firm. "I need to speak with the captain." The attendant's brows furrowed, her expression a mixture of confusion and disbelief. "Ma'am, I'm sorry, but passengers need to remain seated during turbulence. It's not safe to move around." Evelyn nodded, understanding the protocol, but she didn't back down. "I know the risks," she replied evenly. "But this turbulence isn't normal. I can hear it. The engine pitch has changed. Something's wrong. I'm a retired pilot. If the captain needs assistance, I'm here to help." The attendant hesitated, glancing toward the cockpit door. It was clear she wasn't sure how to respond. Evelyn could see the doubt in her eyes, the internal struggle between following rules and trusting a stranger. But there was no time to waste. Another violent jolt shook the plane, and Evelyn steadied herself, her grip firm and her gaze unwavering. "Please," Evelyn urged, "tell him I'm here. That's all I'm asking." Reluctantly, the attendant nodded and moved toward the front of the plane, her steps unsteady as the turbulence worsened. Evelyn watched her go, her heart pounding but her expression calm. She had faced countless emergencies before, but this was different. This time, she wasn't in control, at least not yet. Minutes passed, each one feeling like an eternity. Evelyn kept her eyes on the cockpit door, willing it to open. Around her, passengers clutched their armrests, their faces pale with fear. The tension in the cabin was suffocating. When the intercom crackled to life again, the captain's voice came through, sharp and tense. Ladies and gentlemen, we are navigating a particularly rough patch of air. Please remain seated and keep your seatbelts fastened. We appreciate your cooperation. Evelyn frowned. The turbulence wasn't subsiding, and the captain's tone did little to inspire confidence. She could sense his struggle, the strain in his voice that hinted at something more serious than he was letting on. The young flight attendant reappeared, her face flushed. She leaned toward Evelyn, her voice low. The captain said to stay in your seat. He doesn't need any help. Evelyn's jaw tightened, but she nodded. She knew the captain's pride was likely getting in the way. She also knew there was no point in arguing, not yet. Instead, she focused on the sounds around her, every hum and vibration of the aircraft. Years of experience had taught her to listen, to feel the subtle shifts that others might miss. The plane dipped suddenly, sending a collective gasp through the cabin. Overhead compartments rattled, and a few items fell to the floor. Evelyn's heart raced, but her expression remained steady. She glanced out the window, her sharp eyes scanning the storm clouds that seemed to swallow the plane whole. Flashes of lightning illuminated the swirling darkness, and she could see the faint outline of turbulent air currents. She thought back to her days in the Air Force, flying through storms that tested every ounce of her skill and nerve. Those missions had been dangerous, but she had always trusted her training and instincts. Now, sitting in a passenger seat, she felt the familiar pull to act, to take control. Evelyn's mind raced as she pieced together what she knew. The engine pitch was off, likely a sign of uneven thrust. The turbulence was severe, but it felt compounded by mechanical strain, and the captain, despite his confident front, was struggling to manage it all. A soft voice interrupted her thoughts. "Excuse me, ma'am." Evelyn turned to see the woman sitting beside her, a younger passenger with wide, fearful eyes. "Do you think we're going to be okay?" Evelyn offered a reassuring smile, though she didn't sugarcoat her words. "We're in a tough spot, but planes are built to handle a lot. The crew is trained for emergencies. Just stay calm and keep your seatbelt on." The woman nodded, though her hands still trembled as she clutched the armrests. Evelyn returned her focus to the cockpit door, her mind racing with scenarios. She couldn't shake the feeling that time was running out. Suddenly, another violent jolt rocked the plane, this one harder than the last. Overhead bins popped open, spilling luggage into the aisle. A drink cart tipped over, its contents scattering across the floor. Passengers screamed, and the tension in the cabin reached a breaking point. Evelyn unbuckled her seatbelt, her movements swift but deliberate. She steadied herself against the seat in front of her, ignoring the stares of the other passengers. "Ma'am, you need to stay seated," one of the flight attendants called out, her voice strained. "I can't," Evelyn said firmly, her tone leaving no room for argument. "If I don't act now, this could end badly for all of us." She made her way toward the front of the plane, her steps measured and steady despite the chaos around her. The cockpit door loomed ahead, a barrier between her and the answers she needed. When she reached it, she pressed the intercom button again. Her voice was calm, but carried a weight of authority. "Captain, this is Evelyn Johnson. I've flown through storms like this before. I'm not here to challenge your authority. I'm here to help. If you let me in, we can work together to get everyone through this safely." There was a pause, the longest silence Evelyn had ever endured. She could imagine the captain on the other side, weighing his options, his pride battling against the reality of the situation. Finally, the door cracked open. The captain stood there, his face pale and tense. He didn't speak, but he stepped aside, allowing Evelyn to enter. Inside the cockpit, the scene was even worse than Evelyn had imagined. The co-pilot's hands shook as he gripped the controls, sweat dripping down his forehead. Warning lights blinked on the dashboard, their ominous glow illuminating the storm outside. Evelyn's sharp eyes took in everything at once: the crosswinds, the fluctuating engine readings, the radar filled with storm activity. She could see the autopilot struggling to compensate, overcorrecting in ways that only made the turbulence worse. "You've got a crosswind hitting the left engine hard," Evelyn said, her voice steady. "Disengage the autopilot." You need manual control to balance the thrust. The captain hesitated, his jaw tight. I've got this under control, he said, though his tone lacked conviction. No, you don't, Evelyn said bluntly. Every second you wait puts us closer to disaster. Let me help. The co-pilot looked at the captain, his voice shaking. She's right. The adjustments aren't holding. We're losing stability. With visible reluctance, the captain nodded. Evelyn stepped forward, her hands moving with practiced precision as she guided them through the adjustments. Slowly, the plane began to stabilize, the violent jolts easing into manageable vibrations. But the storm wasn't over, not yet. The edge of the turbulence loomed ahead, and Evelyn knew they were far from safe. The cockpit felt stifling as Evelyn leaned over the console, her eyes darting between the storm-laden radar and the flickering engine indicators. The captain, now visibly sweating, followed her lead with reluctant precision, his movements quick but tinged with an air of defensiveness. The co-pilot was pale, gripping the controls tightly as if sheer force could stabilize the aircraft. Outside, lightning lit up the clouds in bursts of jagged light, casting eerie shadows across the cockpit. Descend to 28,000 feet, Evelyn said evenly, her voice calm but firm. We need to get under the worst of this storm before the turbulence causes structural damage. The captain's hands faltered slightly on the controls, but he adjusted their altitude without argument. Evelyn could feel his resistance, his reluctance to trust her completely, but the stakes were too high for pride to cloud judgment now. As the plane began its descent, Evelyn turned her focus to the co-pilot. How long have you been flying? She asked, not uncannily. 2 years, he admitted, his voice shaky. I've never seen turbulence like this before. Evelyn nodded, her expression softening slightly. You're doing fine. Just keep the plane steady and let me handle the rest. The co-pilot gave a faint nod, though his grip on the controls remained tense. Evelyn could see the fear in his eyes, the uncertainty that came from being thrust into a situation far beyond his experience. It reminded her of her early days in the Air Force, those first few missions where every decision felt like it carried the weight of the world. The captain cleared his throat, his tone sharp. I didn't ask for help, he muttered under his breath, though not so quietly that Evelyn couldn't hear. She didn't take the bait. This isn't about you, she replied simply, her focus never wavering from the controls. It's about getting everyone on this plane home safely. That's all that matters. The captain didn't respond, but his silence spoke volumes. Back in the cabin, the tension was palpable. Passengers clutched their armrests, their faces a mix of fear and confusion. The flight attendants moved cautiously down the aisles, trying to calm nerves and secure anything that had come loose during the turbulence. One of them, a young man with wide eyes, caught the murmurs of a group of passengers near the emergency exit. I heard the engines aren't working right, one woman whispered, her voice trembling. Do you think we're going to crash? We're not going to crash, the flight attendant said quickly, though his own voice betrayed his uncertainty. The pilots are trained for this kind of situation. Another passenger, a man in his mid-40s, shook his head. This feels like more than just turbulence. Are they even telling us the whole truth? The flight attendant swallowed hard, glancing toward the cockpit door. He didn't have answers, and the growing fear in the cabin was becoming harder to contain. Meanwhile, Evelyn was deep in thought, her mind racing as she calculated their next move. The storm ahead was massive, a swirling vortex of clouds and lightning that seemed to stretch endlessly. She could see the strain on the radar, the way the plane's systems were working overtime to keep them stable. We're burning too much fuel, she said suddenly, breaking the tense silence in the cockpit. If we don't reroute to a closer airport, we'll risk running out before we make it through. The captain's jaw tightened. The nearest airport has a shorter runway, he said. This plane wasn't designed to land there. I've landed in worse conditions, Evelyn countered, her tone unwavering. Extend the glide path and adjust for the crosswinds. It's our best option. The co-pilot glanced at the captain, his voice quiet but insistent. She's right. We're not going to make it to our original destination. The captain hesitated, his pride warring with the reality of their situation. Finally, he nodded, though his expression remained tense. "Set the course," he said gruffly. Evelyn leaned over the controls, her hands moving with practiced precision as she guided them through the adjustments. The tension in the cockpit was thick, but she refused to let it distract her. There was too much at stake. As the plane veered slightly toward the new route, another jolt of turbulence shook the cabin. Evelyn steadied herself, her eyes scanning the horizon. She could see the faint outline of the storm's edge, a sliver of hope in an otherwise grim situation. But then, a new sound caught her attention, a faint, irregular hum from the left engine. Her heart sank. "Engine 2 is struggling," she said, her voice low but urgent. "We need to redistribute the load before it fails completely." The captain's hands tightened on the controls. "We're already running on borrowed time," he said. "If that engine goes, we'll lose altitude fast." Evelyn nodded, her mind racing. She knew the risks, but there was no other option. "We can do this," she said firmly, "but we need to act now." The co-pilot looked at her, his fear momentarily replaced by something else: hope. He adjusted the controls as Evelyn instructed, her calm authority giving him the confidence he needed to push through the panic. In the cabin, the passengers felt the plane dip slightly, and the murmurs of fear grew louder. Evelyn could imagine their faces, the way uncertainty and terror would be written across each one. She had been in their position before, during those early flights when every bump and noise felt like a harbinger of disaster. She understood their fear, but she couldn't let it distract her. Every second felt like an eternity as the plane pushed through the storm. The controls vibrated under Evelyn's hands, the strain of the journey evident in every shudder and jolt. But she refused to give up. The storm's edge was close now, the dark clouds thinning slightly as they approached. Evelyn's sharp eyes never left the radar, her mind focused entirely on the task at hand. She knew the hardest part was yet to come, the landing. But for now, she allowed herself a small flicker of hope. "We're almost through," she said quietly, her voice steady. "Just hold it together a little longer." The co-pilot nodded, his hands firm on the controls. Even the captain seemed to relax slightly, his shoulders easing as the worst of the turbulence began to subside. But Evelyn knew better than to let her guard down. The real test was still ahead. The cockpit was silent except for the hum of the engines and the occasional crackle of static from the radio. The storm had loosened its grip on the plane, but the danger was far from over. Evelyn kept her hands steady on the controls, her eyes darting between the horizon and the flickering lights on the console. Every instrument told a story of strain, of systems pushed to their limits, of a machine and its crew fighting to stay in the air. The captain broke the silence. "We're coming up on the alternate airport. The runway is short, too short for this aircraft under normal circumstances." Evelyn's voice was calm, though there was an edge of urgency to it. "It's not about normal circumstances, Captain. We don't have the luxury of options. This is where we land." The co-pilot looked at the two of them nervously. "The crosswinds are still strong, and the left engine, it's not holding steady." "I know," Evelyn replied. "That's why we need to time this perfectly. Reduce speed as much as you can without compromising control. We'll use every inch of that runway." The captain hesitated, his hand hovering over the throttle. He glanced at Evelyn, a flicker of doubt still in his eyes, but it was clear that even he knew there was no alternative. "Fine," he said, his voice tight. "But if this goes wrong—" "It won't," Evelyn interrupted. Her tone left no room for argument. In the cabin, the atmosphere was thick with unease. Passengers whispered in hushed tones, their faces pale as they glanced at one another and out the windows. The flight attendants moved through the aisles, trying to project calm even as the plane continued its shaky descent. The youngest attendant, a woman barely out of her 20s, stopped near a nervous family in the middle row. The mother clutched her child tightly, her knuckles white against her son's small arm. "Are we going to be okay?" the mother asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The attendant hesitated for only a moment before forcing a smile. "The pilots are doing everything they can. We just need to trust them." Her words didn't seem to comfort the woman, who nodded absently and held her child closer. Across the aisle, A man stared intently at his phone, typing out what looked like a message. His fingers trembled slightly as he hit send, and then he closed his eyes, gripping the armrest as if bracing for impact. Evelyn could feel the weight of every life on board pressing against her, a responsibility she hadn't carried since her days in the Air Force. But this wasn't combat, and these weren't soldiers prepared for the risks of war. These were families, children, people who had boarded this flight expecting a routine trip. She had to get them to safety. As the plane dipped lower, the storm clouds finally began to thin, revealing the faint outline of the airport below. The runway looked impossibly small, a narrow strip of asphalt surrounded by open fields. Evelyn could see the lights guiding them in, but the winds were relentless, pushing against the aircraft like an invisible hand determined to force them off course. Crosswinds are at 25 knots, the co-pilot reported, his voice shaking. It's going to be tight. It always is, Evelyn said, her focus unbroken. Adjust for the drift. We're almost there. The captain gripped the controls, his knuckles white. He was no longer questioning Evelyn's decisions, but the tension in his movements betrayed his nerves. Evelyn leaned in slightly, her voice firm but steady. Throttle back. We need to slow her down. The captain obeyed, and the engines whined in protest as the plane's speed decreased. They were close now, too close to turn back, too close to do anything but commit fully to the landing. Evelyn's sharp eyes scanned the instruments one last time, her mind racing through the steps she'd rehearsed 1,000 times in her head. But this wasn't a drill, and there was no room for error. In the cabin, the passengers felt the descent keenly. The plane rocked and swayed, the turbulence still strong enough to elicit gasps and nervous murmurs. A baby cried somewhere near the back, its wails cutting through the tense silence. One man muttered a prayer under his breath, his hands clasped tightly in front of him. Evelyn's voice cut through the noise in the cockpit. Gear down, flaps to full. Keep her steady. The runway was directly ahead now, the lights growing brighter with every passing second. Evelyn could see the winds tugging at the plane, the way the nose dipped slightly with each gust. She took a deep breath, her hands steady on the controls as she guided them closer and closer to the ground. At the last moment, the plane lurched violently to one side, a sharp gust of wind threatening to throw them off course. Evelyn reacted instantly, countering the drift with a precise adjustment that brought the plane back in line with the runway. Her heart pounded in her chest, but her face remained calm, her focus unshakable. We're coming in hot, the captain said, his voice strained. Hold it, Evelyn replied, her tone as steady as ever. Wait for my mark. The ground rushed up to meet them, the runway lights blurring into streaks of white and red. Evelyn's mind was razor-sharp, every calculation and adjustment coming to her with a clarity born of decades of experience. This was the moment where everything would be decided, where every second felt like an eternity. Now, she shouted. The captain pulled back on the controls, and the plane's wheels hit the runway with a bone-jarring thud. Tires screeched against the asphalt as the brakes engaged, the entire aircraft shuddering violently under the strain. Evelyn could feel the plane fighting against the momentum, the sheer weight of it pushing them dangerously close to the edge of the runway. In the cabin, passengers screamed and braced themselves, the force of the landing pressing them back into their seats. Evelyn kept her hands steady, her gaze locked on the rapidly approaching end of the runway. There was no room for doubt, no room for hesitation. This was it. The plane's speed decreased rapidly, the engines roaring in protest as the brakes did their work. Evelyn's pulse pounded in her ears, but she didn't let herself breathe until she felt the plane finally, blessedly, come to a complete stop. The silence that followed was deafening, a moment of stunned stillness that hung in the air like a held breath. But Evelyn knew it wasn't over. Not yet. The heavy silence in the cabin was broken by a slow, tentative ripple of applause. It started with one passenger in the middle rows and spread through the others, a collective outpouring of relief. People clapped, cheered, and even cried, clutching their loved ones as the realization of their survival sank in. The flight attendants exchanged glances of exhaustion and relief, their usual composed professionalism giving way to genuine emotion. In the cockpit, The air was thick with tension. Evelyn released her grip on the controls, her fingers trembling slightly now that the adrenaline had begun to wear off. She allowed herself a brief exhale, but her sharp eyes flicked over the instruments one more time. Something still didn't sit right. The left engine, already compromised, was now entirely offline. It hadn't been the smoothest landing, but they were alive, and for the moment, that was enough. The captain leaned back in his seat, his expression a mix of gratitude and lingering resentment. That was impressive, he admitted grudgingly, his voice heavy with exhaustion. But we're not out of the woods yet. This isn't a major airport. The ground crews here aren't equipped to handle something like this. Evelyn nodded, already aware of the challenges ahead. We need to evacuate the passengers and secure the aircraft as soon as possible. The engine failure means we're sitting on borrowed time. If the hydraulics fail or the fuel lines rupture, she didn't finish the thought, but the weight of her words was clear. The co-pilot, still pale, chimed in nervously. I'll radio the tower and request immediate assistance. Evelyn didn't respond immediately. Her gaze drifted to the radar display, where she noticed something that made her stomach drop. A small but unmistakable blip was approaching fast. Another plane, descending toward the same runway they had just landed on. The realization hit her like a jolt of electricity. The emergency diversion had disrupted the usual flight patterns, and it seemed air traffic control hadn't been able to clear the airspace in time. Captain, she said, her tone sharper now. We have incoming traffic, another plane on approach. The captain's head snapped toward the radar. What? They didn't divert it. There wasn't time, Evelyn replied. We're still on the active runway, and they don't have the clearance to land safely. We need to move this aircraft now. The co-pilot's voice trembled. But the engines, can we even taxi with the left engine offline? We don't have a choice, Evelyn said firmly. We need to clear this runway before they're on top of us. The captain hesitated, his mind racing through the implications. If they tried to move the plane and the hydraulics failed, it could result in an even bigger catastrophe. But staying put wasn't an option either, not with another plane bearing down on them. Fine, he said finally, his voice tight. We'll taxi to the nearest exit point. Co-pilot, get clearance from the tower. The co-pilot scrambled to relay their intentions, his voice shaky but clear. Evelyn reached for the controls again, her focus razor-sharp. The passengers, sensing something was amiss, began murmuring anxiously. The flight attendants tried to calm them, but the growing tension in the cabin was palpable. As the plane began to creep forward, the damaged left engine groaned loudly, a grinding sound that sent shivers through everyone on board. Evelyn's grip on the controls tightened. She could feel the aircraft resisting her commands, the hydraulic systems struggling under the strain. The blip on the radar grew closer, a silent reminder of the ticking clock. Back in the cabin, the atmosphere had shifted from relief to unease. A young man in the rear of the plane stood up, his voice cutting through the murmurs. What's going on? Are we in danger again? One of the flight attendants rushed over, her smile forced but reassuring. Sir, please remain seated. The pilots are handling the situation. But what's happening? He pressed, his voice rising. We just landed. Why are we moving again? Another jolt ran through the plane as the left engine groaned again, the sound reverberating through the cabin. The man's anxiety was mirrored in the faces of the other passengers. Evelyn could hear the growing unrest behind her, but her focus remained unshaken. She couldn't afford any distractions now. The plane in the air was dangerously close now, its silhouette visible through the cockpit window as it descended through the clearing clouds. Evelyn's mind worked rapidly, calculating the distance and speed. They weren't going to make it to the exit point in time. Captain, she said, her voice cutting through the tension like a knife. We need to stop the aircraft here. What? He asked, incredulous. We'll block the runway entirely. If we keep moving, we're risking a complete hydraulic failure, she said. That other plane, its pilots are already committed to their approach. They'll have to initiate a go-around. The captain opened his mouth to argue but stopped himself. Deep down, he knew she was right. With a grim nod, he brought the plane to a halt. Evelyn grabbed the radio and addressed the incoming aircraft. "This is Flight 1767 on the active runway. Abort your landing and initiate a go-around immediately." There was a long, agonizing pause before the other pilot responded. "Copy that, Flight 1767. Aborting landing." Through the windshield, Evelyn watched as the other plane roared overhead, its engines straining as it climbed back into the sky. The sound was deafening, a reminder of just how close they had come to disaster. She exhaled slowly, the weight of the moment pressing down on her chest. But before anyone could celebrate the near miss, a sudden burst of static crackled through the radio, followed by a garbled voice. Evelyn's sharp ears caught only fragments, something about a fuel leak. Her heart sank. She turned to the captain, her face grim. "The left engine," she said quietly. "It's worse than we thought." The realization hit Evelyn like a punch to the gut. A fuel leak in the left engine wasn't just a minor issue, it was a ticking time bomb. She leaned over the captain's shoulder, her voice steady but urgent. "We need to evacuate the passengers now. If that fuel ignites, we won't have time to react." The captain's jaw tightened. He exchanged a brief glance with the co-pilot, both men clearly shaken. "The ground crew isn't ready," he replied, his voice strained. "We can't just unload people onto an unsecured tarmac." Evelyn didn't waver. "We don't have the luxury of waiting. That fuel is leaking dangerously close to the engine heat. If it catches, this whole aircraft will be gone in seconds. We need to move." The captain hesitated, but a sudden sharp crack from the left side of the plane made the decision for him. A faint plume of smoke began to rise from the wing, barely visible but unmistakable. His expression hardened. "Fine, let's do it." Evelyn nodded and grabbed the intercom. Her voice was calm but commanding, cutting through the growing murmurs of panic in the cabin. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is an emergency. We need to evacuate the aircraft immediately. Follow the instructions of the flight attendants and leave everything behind. Your safety is our priority." The passengers erupted into a mixture of gasps and questions, but the flight attendants moved quickly, guiding people toward the exits with practiced efficiency. The emergency slides deployed with a loud hiss, and passengers began filing out, some hesitating, others practically diving toward the exit. Evelyn stayed in the cockpit, her sharp eyes scanning the instruments one last time. The captain looked over at her, his voice quieter now. "You should go too. This isn't your responsibility anymore." But Evelyn shook her head. "Not until everyone is off this plane." The smoke outside thickened, the acrid scent seeping into the cabin. Evelyn could feel the heat intensify as the engine strained under the pressure of the leaking fuel. She turned to the co-pilot. "Get out there and help the flight attendants. We need to move faster." He nodded and hurried out, leaving Evelyn and the captain alone in the cockpit. The captain glanced at her, his face a mixture of guilt and admiration. "I underestimated you," he admitted, his voice low. "I let my assumptions cloud my judgment." Evelyn gave him a faint smile. "Assumptions are dangerous, Captain, in the air or on the ground." A loud pop echoed from the left side of the plane, cutting their conversation short. Evelyn's stomach sank as she saw a small burst of flame erupt near the damaged engine. "That's it," she said sharply. "We're out of time. Let's go." The captain hesitated for only a moment before nodding. Together, they hurried toward the exits, Evelyn pausing to make sure every row had been cleared. The heat was nearly unbearable now, the smell of burning fuel thick in the air. She spotted a young boy crying in his seat, his arms wrapped tightly around a stuffed bear. His parents were already outside, shouting his name frantically from the bottom of the slide. Evelyn rushed to him, her voice gentle but firm. "Come on, sweetheart, we need to go." The boy looked up at her with tear-filled eyes but didn't move. Evelyn knelt down and scooped him up, holding him close as she made her way to the exit. She handed him off to a flight attendant waiting at the slide and gave the boy an encouraging smile. "You're safe now. Go find your parents." The flames outside had grown, licking dangerously close to the fuselage. Evelyn turned back toward the cockpit, but the captain grabbed her arm. "We're the last ones," he said. "It's time to go." She hesitated for a split second, her mind racing through everything that could still go wrong. But he was right. Everyone else was off the plane. She nodded, and together, they slid down to the tarmac, landing hard but unscathed. Emergency crews swarmed the scene, spraying foam over the left wing as passengers huddled together, watching with wide eyes. Evelyn stood off to the side, catching her breath as the adrenaline began to fade. The captain approached her, his expression serious but grateful. "You saved us," he said simply. "All of us." Before Evelyn could respond, a loud explosion rocked the tarmac. Everyone flinched as the left engine finally gave way, sending a fireball into the sky. The firefighters worked quickly to contain the blaze, but it was a stark reminder of how close they had come to disaster. Evelyn turned back to the captain, her voice calm but firm. "We all did our part, but next time, don't wait until it's almost too late to trust someone." He nodded slowly, the weight of her words sinking in. "I won't." As the chaos began to settle, Evelyn found herself standing alone, watching the smoldering wreckage. She felt a strange mix of exhaustion and resolve. The storm had passed, but its lessons lingered. Trust, courage, and action in the face of adversity. These were the things that had kept them alive. And in the end, it wasn't just about surviving the skies. It was about rising above the doubts and assumptions that so often held people back. Evelyn adjusted her cardigan and began walking toward the terminal, her steps steady and her head held high. The whispers of passengers followed her, their words carrying a newfound respect. But she didn't need their validation. She had done what she always did, what was necessary.